Thank you all for joining us today. As I said, we are across the entire globe. We have participants, and time zones is from 12 to 5 to 7 hours away, and to here as well. Today we are here to discuss can China advance the Gulf's stability? We are here to discuss arguably one of the most crucial issues, the most important issues facing the United States and the Gulf states in this year and in the future. In the last 3 years, the relationship between the two most powerful economies and perhaps military powers in the world have oscillated from adversarial to competitive to cooperative and back again with almost whiplash-inducing speed. One can argue that the level of hostile rhetoric emanating from both capitals today reminds people my age of the depths of the Cold War. Are we doomed to become superpower rivals and ignite a new Cold War? The Gulf provides a sort of testing ground as to whether the two countries can stay competitors and even collaborators, or whether the slide towards confrontation is unstoppable. It should not be inevitable. Both countries have an interest in Gulf stability. Yet it would not be the first time that great powers have played out their rivals in distant regions. More importantly, we should also keep in mind that the countries of the Gulf would rather not find themselves forced to choose sides in such rivalry. There's an old adage about what happens to bystanders when elephants begin to fight. They would rather benefit from the relationships with both. Our first speaker, Mr. Xinchun, has had some problems linking on, so we will proceed with Camille Lons. I won't read all the bios, you have them in front of us, but I will proceed with Camille Lons, the Research Associate, International Institute for Strategic Studies. She has been stationed in IISS in Bahrain. Camille?
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for having me for this fascinating discussion. So I've been asked to give a bit of an idea of what the relationship between China and the Gulf is at the moment, and what the different interests, where the different interests are lying. So this relationship between the Gulf and China has been deepening quite dramatically over the past 10 years. And it is a relationship that is mainly based on the economic angle, and especially on the energy relationship, which is one of the pillars of that relation. And the second pillar would be the Belt and Road Initiative and the position of the Gulf on this Belt and Road. And the interesting thing is how this relationship that was mainly based on energy has been diversifying itself over recent years to go towards the tech sector, health corporations, cooperation in lots of different sectors. And a second interesting point as well is the political ramifications of this relationship. And as we see, this deepening relationship between Asia and the Gulf, and between China and the Gulf, is happening against the backdrop of a transforming US role in the region. And as you know, some early signs of US fatigue towards the Middle East, and questionings for the Gulf countries about what this is going to mean for their security and for the architecture, their security architecture of the region. So to give you a few insights first about the energy relationship and the economic interests that we have between China and the Gulf. As I said, it is mainly an energy relationship. China has become over recent years the main importer of oil in the world, and the main importer of oil for Gulf countries. And a lot of, given the fact that these Gulf countries have an important part still of their budgets and state budgets relying on the oil exports, it means that China's imports of their energy is deeply important for their economies. And we'll see with the COVID crisis today that the recovery in Asian countries is going to impact deeply the economic recovery in the Gulf. And on the other side of the spectrum, China, Gulf countries are also very important for China on that front. Saudi Arabia with Russia is the main importer of oil, the main exporter of oil to China. But I would say that one interesting point here to underline is the fact that this relationship is still heavily asymmetrical, because for China, China has been making a lot of efforts over recent years to diversify its energy sources, to try to import more of its energy coming from countries like Russia, from Brazil. And when we look at the share of what Saudi oil exports represent in China's imports, this dependence on Saudi oil exports has been decreasing over the 10 past years, from something about 20% to 10%. And this comes along as well the fact that China has been trying to develop its own domestic production. It has also been stockpiling over the past decade a lot of these oil exports. And so, according to some studies, it is possible that China has about 4 months of oil reserves, which I don't mean here that the Gulf is not important for China. It is very important, and Gulf stability is very important for China. But China has a little bit more leverage in this relationship that Gulf countries have. And we see that during the Iran crisis in the late 2019, early 2020, the fact that China has been quite reluctant to jump in during the crisis and has been quite absent from the crisis shows that that for China the region is very important for its energy supplies, but it might be it considers that it has also other sources, and that the threat is not as vital as we could think it is, and it's not ready to jump in politically because of these energy supplies. Another point is the importance of the Belt and Road Initiative as well. And here, what is interesting to see, and it's the same for the energy sector, is how Gulf countries have been very proactive in trying to deepening this relationship and trying to attract Chinese interests over recent years. And the UAE is probably the country that has been the most proactive in doing so, and trying to locate itself on the BRI. And so we see that the economic relationship with China has been diversifying itself importantly. And in the tech sector, for example, the UAE has been doing a lot of partnerships with China and with the company Huawei. We see also recently during the pandemic the way that the UAE has been trying to coordinate a lot with China during the pandemic to position itself as an important logistics hub for carrying some medical supplies across the globe. It has also recently announced that they're working on a vaccine with Beijing. They created a detection lab to fight the pandemic with a Chinese company in the UAE. So all these signs show that this economic relationship is going much larger than just an energy relationship. And as I said at the beginning, there's an important political context here that is underpinning these efforts, especially from the Gulf side, to try to attract Chinese interest in the region. And this underlying context is the evolution of the role of the US in the region, and the deepening sentiment in the Gulf that the US might not be as ready as it was in the past to step in case of an escalation in the region, and the feeling that there is a fatigue from the US, and that for Gulf countries this has pushed Gulf capitals to try diversify their relationship with Asian countries and especially with China. And on the Chinese side, I would say that yes, there is deepening interest in the Gulf and deepening of ties, but we see that at the same time, China has been quite content with the status quo until now, and with the security architecture that is being supported by the US. They have been accused by Washington to act as a free rider in the region when it comes especially to maritime security. And despite an increasing security presence as well of Beijing, whether it is in the base in Djibouti or doing some maritime exercises with Iran or Saudi Arabia last year, these efforts are still quite limited, and the sentiment is that for now the Middle East remains a complicated region. It's not a core priority for Beijing, and so they have until now been quite content to use the US-led security architecture. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Camille. We'd like to go on to Dr. NIU Xinchun. Please excuse my pronunciation. Currently the director of the Institute of Middle East Studies and deputy director of the Institute of American Studies in the past. Dr. NIU.
Hello, thank you very much, Ambassador Theros. I will very briefly make 5 points about China's role in the Gulf area, and about the current situation and the future situation in the Gulf, and the effect of China-United States relations on the Gulf area. Firstly, I think the Gulf is very important to Chinese economic development at the present time, and will be very important to Chinese economic in the future. The reason is that the Gulf is the main provider of Chinese oil. Now the Gulf is about half of Chinese oil import comes from Gulf area, and about 1/3 of Gulf countries' oil export go to China. So no matter whatever happened in the future in the international energy market, no matter how China try to diversify its energy import, I think that this basic energy structure between China and the Gulf will not change. The reason is that in the foreseeable future, China's economic development will heavily dependent on oil, and heavily dependent on oil import. In terms of oil import, nobody can replace Gulf countries in the future. So secondly, I think in the near future, the Gulf countries will difficult. There are more challenges for Gulf countries politically and economically, especially in economic areas. Both the COVID pandemic and the low oil price will produce a devastating effect on the Gulf areas. We know that oil is the basic pillar of Gulf countries' political, economic, and security structure. It looks very highly likely that the oil price will lower for longer. If that is true, that will fundamentally change the Gulf countries. That will change the Gulf countries' economic structure, social structure, and political structure. All the Gulf countries in the near future will face economic difficulties and social difficulties and political difficulties. The Another reason is that the United States is disengaging from Gulf area. And the United States, in the past 70 years, the United States is a basic pillar of Gulf countries' security structure. That would also fundamentally change the dynamics in the Gulf area. Thirdly, I think the economic cooperation between China and the Gulf countries will face a lot of challenges. In other words, personally, I think for the economic cooperation between Gulf countries and China, the good time has already gone. It will not come back in the near future. The best time for the cooperation between China and the Gulf countries is from the year 2000 to 2014. During that time, the oil price has risen from about $30 per barrel to about $100 per barrel. And at the same time, China's GDP has grown from 1 trillion to 10 trillion. So at that time, both Gulf countries' economy and the Chinese economy has expanded dramatically. So that is the best period of Gulf countries and China economic cooperation. But since the 2014, both Gulf countries' economy and Chinese economy has come into a new normal. The Chinese economic growth rate has declined from 2 digit to 1 digit, and the oil price is now just about above $20 a barrel. So this situation will persist in the foreseeable future. So that means the rooms for Gulf country and China economic cooperation has dramatically shrinked. So that is my third point. Fourthly, the fourth point is that the global competition between China and the United States has already spilled over into the Gulf. So the China-United States relationship would be a wild card for the Gulf areas. Personally, I don't think the Middle East or Gulf area should be the battleground for the great power competitions. The reason is that China's main interest in Gulf area is in economic area. China don't have much political influence and security influence in Gulf area. So I don't think China's economic presence pose any security and political challenge to United States interests. But unfortunately, in the past half a year, I have seen a lot of signs that United States has taken Gulf area as a battleground to compete with China. Just recently, the commander of Central Command, McKenzie, has said that as a commander of Central Command, his main job is to prevent Gulf countries turn to China for buying arms. So the last point is that I think in the near future, China's role in the Gulf area is mainly manifested in economic area. I don't see any signs China will politically involved in Gulf areas and militarily involved in Gulf areas. I pause here.
Thank you, Mr. Liu. This has been a fascinating discussion so far. I'd like to proceed now with Ms. Lucille Greer, the Schwartzman Fellow at the Wilson Center, Kissinger's Institute on China and the United States. She has a long history of dealing and studying, researching and studying the relationship between China and the Gulf states. And she also happens to be the only panelist who is in my time zone today. Ms. Greer.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Ambassador Theros. I mean, it's an honor to be speaking amongst such distinguished colleagues on a topic that is becoming increasingly important for both the Gulf states and American foreign policy, not just in the Middle East, but the world at large. So my role here today is to talk about two of the more fraught aspects of China's risk-averse regional strategy, its military expansion in the Gulf, and its navigation of the Saudi-Iranian rivalry. So hopefully this will give some insight into some of the hard power considerations that China has in the Gulf, as well as its diplomatic maneuvering in a geopolitically tense part of the world. So I'll begin by talking about China's military expansion into the Gulf, starting with the most apparent development, which is the naval base in Djibouti. So in late 2015, China signed a 10-year lease agreement to build its first foreign military base off the coast of Djibouti. About 2 years later, in July of 2017, the People's Liberation Army Navy deployed ships from the South Sea Fleet to officially open its base in Obak. By July 2019, China has deployed about 1,000 troops to Obak and 32 convoy flotillas to Somali and adjacent waters. So this new base has raised a lot of eyebrows around the world, particularly in the United States, for a few reasons. Primarily that this base is on the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which connects the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean via the Suez Canal. It's one of the most strategic waterways in the world. Amongst other commodities, a great deal of oil flows through the strait. So in 2018 alone, 16.2 million barrels per day of crude oil and other petroleum products passed through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. However, when brought up with this sort of controversy, Chinese public officials all agree that the purpose of the base is to serve as a logistical point for China's various anti-piracy operations along the East African coast. And it's absolutely true that China does need to be worried about piracy. This is a very legitimate interest they have. Piracy has been on the rise in recent years, and it's even gotten the cinematic treatment in both the United States and China. So in the US, we had Captain Phillips, and in China, we had Wolf Warrior 2, which is part of China's smash hit franchise series about PLA special ops forces. So incidentally, the sequel that treats piracy sort of as one of the subjects of the film, when it came out in July of 2017, it became the highest all-time grossing film in China, which was the same month that the naval base opened in Djibouti. So China is the world's top exporter of containerized cargo, which shipping about 3 times as much as the United States, who's number 2 on that list. With piracy estimated to affect 90% of the world's sea lines, China has a great deal to lose to piracy. So China has been involved in escort operations with the multilateral shared awareness and deconfliction missions that patrol East African waters since 2009, although they were initially reluctant to be involved. So the base in Djibouti is a natural extension of these operations. I think it's also useful to remember here that it's not inherently unusual to have a base on the coast of Djibouti. So the US, France, Italy, Japan, and the EU all have bases. And Saudi Arabia has been approved by the Djibouti government to open its own base as well. So already we have an alignment of Gulf, international, and Chinese security priorities. There are some other reasons for China's base in Djibouti, other than sort of the sticker reason of anti-piracy operations and counterterrorism operations. So one reason for the base is that it could provide logistical support for military evacuations from the region. So China very notably evacuated its citizens and some foreigners from Libya in 2011 and Yemen in 2015, that latter evacuation being China's first military evacuation. As China is spreading out across the world, it runs the risk of its citizens coming under fire in some more turbulent regions. It's estimated that there are some 1 million Chinese expats living and working in the MENA region. So given that China views the Middle East as a chaotic place, it makes sense that they would make this investment to protect their own business interests as well as their people. There are some other more belligerent suspicions about the nature of the base. So in 2018, the US accused the Chinese Navy of directing lasers at American aircraft from the base, which China denied. There's also some questions about China drawing Djibouti into debt entrapment, which is part of the larger conversation about China's policies in the developing world. Another reason for the base is that it can provide logistical support to different military exercises China is doing in the Gulf. The most recent of which was the tripartite exercises last December in the Gulf of Oman between China, Russia, and Iran. And these exercises can be pursued under non-controversial titles like anti-piracy. So these exercises have also led to optimism in the Chinese press that China can acquire more arms customers. Although China is not a major arms dealer in the Gulf, its share of the trade has been growing over the past few years. So the tripartite exercises with Russia and Iran bring me to my second point, which is the Saudi-Iranian rivalry, which we all know is one of the shapers of Gulf stability. So China has strategic partnerships with both Saudi Arabia and Iran, which is the highest level of alliance that it can designate amongst its bilateral relationships in the Gulf. In the Middle East, as in the rest of the world, China prefers the leverage that it has in one-on-one bilateral relationships rather than dealing with multilateral bodies. So that it's able to have these productive relationships with two rivaling states is very emblematic of its policy in the region. So think about Israel and Palestine, or Syria and its detractors, or Qatar and the bloc that opposes it. It's been able to achieve that through a strategy of deft balance between parties. So this is very plain in the case of Saudi Arabia and Iran. So in December of 2019, as I said before, China participated in tripartite exercises with Russia and Iran. Those exercises had been rumored since October. In November, China's Navy Sea Dragon Commando Unit conducted joint counterterrorism exercises with the Saudi Royal Navy's Western Fleet. So when it comes to security issues, China deals its support out with a very light, even hand. China also counts a great deal on rhetoric to smooth things over with its partners in the region. So one of the biggest ways that we can see this being applied is the mythology of the Silk Road. So we have all these fascinating stories of Zheng Chen, who went to ancient Persia during the 2nd century BCE, or the Chinese Muslim sailor Zheng He, who completed his Hajj in Mecca and Medina during one of his voyages to the Middle East. So we see diplomats on both sides returning again and again to this history, even though it has little to no bearing on the political realities of the Middle East today. So this history is told in an overwhelmingly positive way, in a way that it can unite both Saudi Arabia and Iran in the narrative that China is using to try and unite the world behind the BRI. So in the case of the Saudi-Iranian rivalry in particular, China is aided by the fact that the rivalry itself is not a static factor. Sometimes we can think of it as this massive, unmoving force, but the reality is that it goes through periods of waxing and waning, and that as geographic neighbors, they do have some shared interests in common and have even come close to what looks like cooperation over the years. So it is in these periods that China is able to make greater overtures to not only just those two countries, but the region at large, because this is sort of a marker of stability. So let's think about when the BRI was announced in 2013. At that time, under the leadership of President Obama in the United States and President Rouhani in Iran, it looked like people were very optimistic about Iran's return to the international community. And it made sense at the time with the BRI for Iran to be a good team player with the international community. But the climate on this issue has changed a great deal in the intervening years, which has included a ramping up of the Saudi-Iranian rivalry. So while China has done a pretty good job of maintaining relations with each country, it will not go out on a limb to mend different animosities they might have. So after the drone strikes on the Abqaiq and Khurais oil fields last year, China only issued a rather bland statement about it opposing any action that may intensify events in the Middle East. So if such a high value target to China as oil, which it considers to be a huge priority, can be at risk and China is unwilling or incapable of stepping in to diffuse tensions between two countries where it has the relationships and it has the leverage, we have much further to go before China can meaningfully advance Gulf stability. I think this also is true when it comes to the base in Djibouti. One Arab diplomat I spoke to who serves in China on this topic said that the base was no great accomplishment. Those were his words. China is a valuable actor in the Gulf, to be sure, but the Middle East is not high on China's own foreign policy agenda, so it won't take any undue risks. So I'll wrap it up here, and I look forward to the discussion and your questions.
Thank you so much. That is fascinating, and you've already caused me to have a couple of questions on that one. Let me remind our audience that if you please put your questions on the Q&A so we can follow them. I'd like to ask all the panelists a question now that pertains to Ms. Greer's last comments about there are outside powers, Russia, China, Russia, India, France, in addition to the United States, who have a military and political presence in the region. Could anyone comment on, I've not heard much commentary from them. Do they show an interest? Is there something that specifically intrigues them, bothers them, concerns them in the relationship between China, the United States, and the Gulf? Anyone care to take that question? Lucille?
I'll go. Yes, I'll go. When it comes to Russia, there's sort of an interesting dynamic there between China and Russia in the Middle East. I don't think Russia has any sort of concerns or feelings of competition from China when it comes to its military activities in the Middle East. What China does do with Russia in the region, we can see this particularly acutely in sort of the development of the Syrian crisis since 2011, is that China is able to sort of allow Russia to sort of represent its own political interests in the Middle East and then pairs that with its own military adventurism. So in that way, Russia draws a lot of the international criticism away from China, where China just sort of aligns with this softer, I guess, relatively softer presence of just UN vetoes, and then Russia actually does the actual execution of some of those policy priorities that China does share.
My second question for any and all of the participants. The United States, in prosecuting its own policies with Iran, has just announced that it will attempt to impose, it has just gone to the United Nations Security Council and announced that it intends to impose a snapback of sanctions on Iran, particularly sanctions on the sale and purchase of military equipment. How do we expect China will react to this? China is a permanent member of the Security Council and has the ability to veto, to veto resolutions in the Security Council. This one is a little bit more complicated to how it will happen. But Dr. Niu, do you have any thoughts on the subject?
Yes, I think it's very clear China's position is persistent that. Undoubtedly, I think China will against the United States proposal. The reason is that China think United States withdraw unilaterally from the JCPOA. That is the biggest mistake. So United States made a wrong choice at first. So United States actually has violated the JCPOA at first. Until now, we don't think Iran has significantly violated the JCPOA. So we will against the United States proposal.
Camille, Lucille, any comments as well?
Yes, sure. To complete a bit what Professor Niu has been saying, we have seen that in the past sanctions happening towards Iran, that China's way of reacting has been to, yes, protest against the US position, but in practice we see that it has decreased significantly. For example, its oil imports from Iran, and it's been quite compliant with the sanctions. And we see that despite the hopes at the time that China could probably step in and save the JCPOA, China has not necessarily been willing to do so. And so it is probable for future sanctions as well that China is going to continue such a step. And we see the reaction on the Iranian side as well, that there is quite a delusion of China's possibility to really play a critical role here in confronting the US.
You use the term delusion. Does that mean that you do not think that China will play, in fact, satisfy the Iranians or play a critical role?
Or maybe I just tried to translate a French word into English.
I'm sorry.
Désillusion, sorry for this.
We have take a few questions from the audience. Is China really threatening U.S. interests specifically in the Gulf? Is there a concrete subject where Chinese and American interests may collide or contradict or threaten each other for any of the panelists?
No.
I think off the bat, I mean, China is, while it does have all these vested interests in the Gulf, there's just no way it's going to directly have sort of showdown with the United States in the region, because China has this understanding, that it would be completely unmatched in terms of political willingness and also military capability. The economic side of things is very, very powerful, and that should not be discounted. But China does not seek to sort of, replace the United States in the region. Can it act as sort of needle at the U.S. in these really insecure points? Absolutely. I think that some of the action we see on Iran is sort of consistent with that. But however, even as Camille rightly said, that since the sort of phase one parts of the U.S.-China trade deal, China has been much more sensitive to Iranian sanctions. You can look at sort of one of the banks that did a lot of business with Iran, the Bank of Kunlun, has really ratcheted back its sort of financial obligations and transactions with Iran. So that's sort of how that sort of comparison stacks up.
On that note, however, the United States is aggressively going after some Chinese interests, again, for worldwide reasons rather than local. For example, it has brought great pressure on several of the Gulf states not to put Huawei equipment into their expanding 5G networks. Will China react to this? Dr. Niu? Yeah.
So firstly, I want to say a few words about your last question. I don't think China's presence in the Middle East pose any challenge or damage to United States' political and security interests. The reason is that China don't have the capability to do that. China don't have intention to do that. There is no any signs China will do that. From the capability perspective, China is the only one of United Nations permanent member which do not have a military base in the Middle East. China is the only big powers which do not have political allies in the Middle East. If you don't have local allies, if you don't have a military base, don't have a military presence in the Middle East, how can you pose a grave challenge to the superpower United States? So personally, I think the United States public officials has an overstatement on China's threat in the Middle East. Actually, I think that is hysteria. So as you mentioned that, we have noticed that recently United States has forced the Gulf countries to prevent Huawei's 5G equipment in Gulf countries. United States has forced Israel to prevent China's economic presence in Israel. That is a big concern for China. But what can we do is that we try to convince both United States and the Gulf countries that China's economic presence is a benefit to everyone instead of that is a threat. So I don't think the Gulf countries is willing to face a choice between United States and China. In the foreseeable future, United States will be the most important political and military players in the Middle East. And China's economic presence will increase. And I think Gulf countries need both. They don't want to choose between China and the United States.
Thank you, Dr. Niu. Camille, you raised your hand.
Yes, just to add a couple of points to the previous question, also to reply on the 5G question. I think, yes, definitely, as Lucille mentioned, there is, it's quite unlikely that we see a direct confrontation, but what is interesting and what needs to be assessed is the geoeconomic consequences of China's economic presence and in the region, and what kind of leverage it gives to China. And there are two interesting things. First, the Chinese investments in ports infrastructures and logistics, and what kind of leverage that gives to China in the region, and how this could be leveraged as well against US interests. And the second one, as you mentioned, the technology sector, and how I'm currently working on a mapping for IISS, mapping all the Chinese investment on the digital Silk Road in the Middle East, and it's quite incredible. And especially Huawei, ZTE have been very present in the region. Huawei has some labs where they are supporting some researchers and officials, taking them to China to train them. So it is very interesting development. And again, the question here is how this is going to affect the US interest in terms of technology transfers. And so we're not talking about direct confrontation, but it's about assessing how China is creating leverages, economically speaking, in the region.
Thank you. From a good friend, Dr. Riyaf Naqshbandi from American University, who teaches a course on China and the 21st century Silk Road. He would like to ask your opinions on to what degree will the economic slowdown, the worldwide economic slowdown, affect China's willingness to invest in Silk Road projects in the Gulf region, and in particular in Kuwait. Any volunteers? Dr. Niu.
Okay. Of course, the world economic slowdown and Chinese economic slowdown will have effect on China's One Belt, One Road initiatives. Actually, I think the biggest factor is the situation in Gulf. Why China is so cautious about its political involvement and military involvement and the economic involvement in the Middle East is that because in this area, the risk is too high and benefits is not so high. So I think in the future, if the situation in Gulf area is not so good, and China have to balance its domestic economic needs and international economic development. So I don't think in the foreseeable future, China will dramatically increase its economic investment in Gulf areas, because the economic situation is not so good.
In that regard, for Dr. Niu, could you say, venture where China places the Gulf in its worldwide priorities? Will it, will there be more investment, more of a cut in investment in the Gulf than there would, say, in Europe or in Africa? Or do you think this is general across the board, that China's investment activities in the Silk Road will be limited worldwide?
I think compare with Africa, Europe, and the United States, Latin America. Actually, in the past 5 years, China's investment in Gulf area is not so impressive. The reason is that the economic situation is not good. I don't think China made that choice based on political or security consideration. Personally, I think it completely based on economic considerations. Whether China will reduce or increase investment in Gulf, that will depend on the Gulf countries' economic situation in the near future. Again, I don't think China will compete with the United States in Gulf area. If China wants to compete with United States globally, I think Asia Pacific is the first choice. Middle East and the Gulf area is the least choice. Because at that area, China don't have any advantage.
Camille, I saw you're waving your hand.
Yes, just if I could add a quick remark to Professor Niu, I agree with him that indeed China is likely to face some debt crisis along the Belt and Road in other countries, and this is going to probably have effects as well on its capacity to continue investing in regions like in the Gulf. I would say, however, that the situation in the Gulf is quite different from the rest of the Belt and Road, because the Gulf countries are among the only countries of the Belt and Road that have actually the capacity to finance a lot of these projects. And so it will also depend a lot on the capacity of these countries and the willingness to continue these projects and to invest in them. A lot of the projects, especially all port infrastructures, have been financed also in big part by the Gulf countries themselves. But again, the picture I think is going to be nuanced depending on which countries. And here, Kuwait, Oman as well, or countries where these projects have been slower to take place than in the UAE or Saudi Arabia. The port of Duqm in Oman has been very slow to take off, and it's been quite difficult to attract the level of investments that they were expecting. And same for Kuwait, and there are probably as well like some political ramifications between the Gulf states and some competition between Gulf states for getting these Chinese investments that could also explain why Kuwait has been so slow to move on these Chinese projects.
Thank you. Changing gears now from the economic confrontation or the political confrontation, and speaking only directly to Chinese Gulf relations, from Ellen Lapson, another good friend, could the panelists comment on the cultural and religious dimensions of China's approach to the region, permitting Chinese Muslims to conduct the Hajj, to allow Muslim world cultural contact with Chinese Muslims, the embarrassing question of the Uyghurs. How does the Gulf view China in those cultural and religious and social terms? Camille?
Lucille, please, sorry.
Thanks.
Lucille.
China actually has engaged in a great deal of Hajj diplomacy in sort of its relationship with Saudi Arabia. Although obviously we should caveat this with, of course, the Hajj as an institution is ostensibly free from political influence. It does make a nice opportunity for countries to get together with Saudi Arabia. So China, sends all these, Hajj pilgrimages. There are meetings with the the Imam of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. So there's definitely these sort of, connections. I mean, Islam itself has a very long history in China, and they sort of talk this up when they talk to each other, despite the fact that, there's obviously this clash of, this, avowedly atheist communist country, and then Saudi Arabia, on the other hand. But I think the two of them, they sort of look past each other ideologically on that point, because I think that they care more about sort of the economic ties rather than the cultural, which I think also speaks to a level of sort of the lack of cultural understanding between China and the Middle East. A lot of Gulf countries, still have a hard time reckoning with the United States culturally, and yet we seem to be pretty good at doing business. And China is on a similar route. As for the Uyghurs, I think that a lot of that is something I think that can be attributed largely to sort of the economic power that China has in the region, but also some other soft power initiatives that it's doing. So it has, close connections with a lot of Islamic institutions, the OIC, for instance. So all those things paired together with the Gulf's own reticence to sort of criticize China on human rights, because I think if the Gulf criticizes anyone on human rights, then they'll have that charge leveled at them in reverse quite swiftly. So there's a lot of factors at play sort of leading into sort of China's silence, the region's silence on Uyghurs. But there's definitely this level of cultural interchange between the two. It also goes back to that sort of, myth of the Silk Road, that the two countries can really connect to each other on culturally and historically speaking.
Thank you. Question asked that I certainly can't answer. How would China react to a change in administrations in the United States, or more to the point, since we don't know what the new administrations would be like in the United States, more to the point, is much of China's policy towards the Gulf hedging, waiting for the results of the elections, or some of the Gulf states like Iran clearly are doing, hedging to see about the results of the American elections? Lucille.
So I think that, the entire world is waiting for the change in administration. I think that there's a lot of uncertainty with the United States' commitment in the region under the Trump administration, and whether, he remains in the White House come November will absolutely be part of this whole conversation that we're having. I'm not sure what, a potential Democratic administration would do differently. I mean, both of them have vowed to be hard on China, and a very easy place for the United States to be rhetorically hard on China is in the Middle East, because, it makes people quite nervous. So I'd be curious to see how this dynamic would go with an administration change. I think if we still stayed with a Trump administration, it would be, probably intensifying the China-U.S. divorce. If we had a Democratic administration, I'm not sure we'd have anything significantly different than that. So that's sort of my American commentary on that.
Camille.
Yes, I'm not American, and I'm not a specialist of American politics, but it looks like the American policy on China wouldn't change with the change of administration, and it looks like it is becoming something quite consistent across the board. And so I don't think that this would have necessarily a huge impact on the current way the U.S. is dealing with the region and with China at the moment.
Dr. Neal, has there been much discussion or commentary in China on planning for a change in administration?
Of course, there are a lot of discussion and comments about the change of leadership in United States in November. But what I want to say is that although the whole world is waiting the change in White House, but I don't think China's Gulf policy is awaiting the United States leadership. I don't think China's Gulf policy will change following United States leadership change. Actually, I think China's Gulf policy is pretty consistent. I don't think that will have any change in the near future. China will continue to focus on economic cooperation with the Gulf countries and avoid political and military involvement. China will continue to keep good relations with every players in Gulf areas, including Saudi Arabia, Iran, Israel, and Turkey, Egypt, every big players, and keep a balanced relationship with everyone. Avoid sided with everyone.
Thank you. Dr. James Dorsey in Singapore has an interesting question. He was struck by Dr. Niu's projection of China-Gulf relations being beyond their heyday in contrast to Western perceptions. Most analysts would agree that China wants to remain politically aloof. The question is how sustainable that is given the potential of changing Gulf expectations dependent on evolution in the region and obvious concerns China must have if the U.S. security structure that it relies on is no longer perceived as reliable. I suppose the short version of that question is, how would China react to an absence of an American presence, to in fact the president carrying out what is clearly would be a popular move in the United States, which is reducing the American security footprint and obligations in the Gulf region? For any of our panelists.
Okay. This is a very good question. And actually, I think nobody knows whether United States will significantly disengage from a Gulf area, I mean politically or militarily, or how will United States disengage from Gulf areas, and when will United States be absent in Gulf areas? So the honest answer is that nobody knows how China will react to that point. But I think until now, China's policy is successful, or at least okay. We keep the good relations with every players. So my opinion is that in the foreseeable future, no broken, no fix. China will continue its current policy.
Camille, how, just as the European here, how do you think the Europeans would respond? I mean, would they see China as, if the United States began to withdraw from the Gulf, would they see China as a competitor, or a cooperator, a collaborator? How do you think there would be, the response would be in France and then Europe generally?
So the Europeans for the moment have been trying to strike the good balance between the US and China, because they have strong like economic interests with China, and they don't want to get stuck in the crossfire between China and the US, and they have no interest in that. At the same time, we see that the rhetoric towards China from the EU has become stronger recently. And they have tried also, when it comes to the Gulf, the EU and European states have tried to play a more significant role. The problem is that with that, the US, this is very difficult at the moment. So for example, when we see on the maritime security issue at the moment of the Iranian crisis, some European countries, led mainly by France, have tried to set up this maritime security initiative that was distinct from the US one, because they didn't want to fall into the anti-Iran US rhetoric. But this initiative has not gone very far, because without, I was in Bahrain where the US Navy is based there, and I was seeing the discussions, and the problem is that this initiative didn't go very far without the US support and without cooperating with the US. So on a purely security point of view, the Europeans are still betting on the fact that the US is not going to withdraw from the region, because they have been announcing that they were going to do so for quite a number of administrations, and it's not been happening. And so they are betting on the fact that the US is going to remain present in the region for the years to come.
Thank you. Another question. In the case of the nightmare scenario where the United States and Iran actually escalate into a serious confrontation, one that involves a shooting war, the closing of the Gulf, air raids, attacks, and damage to facilities, how would China react? I mean, China clearly would have to worry a lot about simply the security of its energy supplies, but would it be working more on trying to de-escalate or just distancing itself from such a conflict?
I'll go. So
Okay.
I think we saw sort of the tiptoeing towards that nightmare scenario earlier in January when the United States drone strike killed the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani. And lots of people were sort of, guessing about this ultimate escalation and then finally war between Iran and the United States. And I think that this comes back to thinking sort of about what China's own sort of domestic military culture. So we know that the PLA, it's obviously we have all these conversations about build up, particularly the Navy, but it's not a very battle tested military. And I think that also is reflected in sort of the Chinese population is there's a very low willingness to send their sons and daughters to war and conflict. So when this was happening in January, I mean, there's a very high bar, I think, for China sort of becoming involved in a sort of a hot conflict like that. And the death of an Iranian general who most Chinese people don't know his name, is not going to be enough satisfaction for Chinese people to be involved in that. So if it were sort of this nightmare scenario of conflict between the US and Iran, China does have a lot of vested interest in Iran, but as we've talked about before, it's sort of pulling back a bit in the past couple of years. I don't think it's going to become involved. It'll probably do some efforts at de-escalation, but again, we've seen that China doesn't want to overcommit to de-escalation. I think this would be a different conversation if we were talking about, Taiwan or Korea or some place like that. But when it comes to Iran, China will definitely try and stay out of it if possible.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time. It's been, unfortunately, coming to the end of our time. It's a fascinating discussion. I could keep this up for a long time. Let me, in closing, asking each of the panelists to make a closing comment, a short one. I would like them to address my question. Do you think that the United States and China will avoid dragging their larger worldwide competition, adversarial relationship, whatever you call it, into the Gulf, or is there a danger that that Chinese-American relations could adversely affect the situation in the Gulf? Dr. New?
Yeah, I think from Chinese side, at least my personal opinion is that China will try its best to avoid the great power competition in Gulf areas. But unfortunately, as I mentioned that in the past half years, United States has overstated the interest clash between China and the United States, overstated China's political and military intention in Gulf area. So there is a real risk that the competition between China and the United States will affect the stability and the prosperity of our Gulf areas.
Camille?
Yes, I would say as the tensions between the US and China are ramping up, there is indeed an increased risk that the Gulf is going to be in the middle of the crossfire. For the moment, they have managed to keep a good balance, and on certain topics like the 5G, most of the Gulf countries have been signing deals with Huawei on developing the 5G networks, and they haven't come under huge pressure from the US. They had a bit of pressure, but not huge. And so for the moment, they have managed to keep this balance, and other countries like Israel have been under more pressure, for example, on this front. But it is definitely likely that 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 they will be under increased challenge linked to this U.S.-China rivalry in the coming months and years.
And Lucille?
I agree with my colleagues that it's very entirely possible that the sort of increasing tensions between China and the United States will play out in the Gulf, because the Gulf is a place where the United States has made a great deal of investment, but also a place where China has a lot of economic interest, and then some issues that touch on their own closely held, security priorities. So I think, like Camille said, these countries have done a decent job of trying to balance between the two. Asking whether one country will have to choose between one and another, I don't know. That might be a very American way of asking that question. But I think that it's definitely something to keep an eye out for sure.
Well, thank you all very much. We're just a couple of minutes over our time. A fascinating discussion. I wish we had gotten to all the questions that were asked, but I felt like dominating the discussion with my own questions. But thank you all very much, and we hope to see you again soon, and hopefully in person. Thank you again.